Chevy didn't just stop making the 302, they silenced it. This high-revving beast was so good, so fast, and so unstoppable that GM had no choice but to shut it down before it ruined their corporate game plan. Why would GM kill off an engine that was nearly unbeatable on the track? Here's the untold shocking truth behind Chevy's banned 302 V8 engine. Rock music was shaking the world, space exploration was capturing imaginations, and muscle cars were ruling the streets. Meanwhile, deep inside Chevrolet's engineering department, something groundbreaking was taking shape. Ford had just unleashed the Mustang, leaving General Motors, GM, scrambling for an answer. Chevrolet needed a machine that could match, or even surpass, the competition. Something built for speed, dominance, and victory. But there was a major roadblock. General Motors had strict policies on engine size, restricting performance models to nothing smaller than 350 cubic inches. To executives, developing a compact, high-revving engine seemed pointless. They were convinced that their big block monsters, known for their raw power and rock-solid reliability, were enough to keep winning races. After all, GM engines had a reputation for lasting through grueling races and pushing limits without breaking down. Chevy's engineers, however, weren't about to let corporate restrictions hold them back. They knew that conquering the Trans Am Racing Series meant working within its strict 305 cubic inch engine limit. The challenge was clear: design an engine that fit the rules while delivering enough power to crush the competition, all while keeping GM's legendary durability intact. Origin and the Z/28's secret weapon. At first, there was no obvious solution. Chevrolet's smallest V8 at the time was the 327, which was too big. Ford already had a 302 V8 in its Mustang, giving them a huge advantage. Chevy had to act fast and came up with the mind-blowing idea of the 302 V8 engine. This wasn't just another small block V8, it was a high-revving monster. It was built to scream all the way to 7,000 RPM, something unheard of in American V8s at the time. Chevrolet needed a car to put this beast in, so they created a special performance package for the Camaro called the Z/28. But there was a catch. Chevy didn't advertise it. There were no flashy commercials, no magazine covers, nothing. Why? Because the 302 was never supposed to exist. It broke GM's rules. The corporate bosses didn't want this engine out in the wild. It was too fast, too aggressive, and it threatened their own lineup. If a small block V8 could keep up with their bigger engines, what would happen to their beloved 396 and 427 big blocks? But Chevy's engineers didn't care. They knew they had created something special, so they quietly slipped it into production. The truth about horsepower. Officially, the 302 V8 was rated at 290 horsepower at 5,800 RPM. But anyone who drove one knew that number was a joke. With some simple tuning, the engine easily made 376 horsepower. And with racing modifications, it could hit 465 horsepower. How did they hide the real numbers? By measuring horsepower at a lower RPM than the engine's true peak. It was a common trick in the muscle car era, but the 302 took it to another level. This was an engine that could punch far above its weight class, from the streets to the track. While most people didn't even know the Z/28 existed, real car enthusiasts took notice. Chevy secretly included a box of tubular headers in the trunk of some Z28s. Install those, tweak the carburetor, adjust the timing, and suddenly you have a race-ready car right from the dealership. On the track, the 302 V8 was a nightmare for Ford. The Z/28 Camaro won the Trans Am Championship in 1968 and 1969. The engine wasn't just fast, it was reliable. It could handle brutal high RPM racing without breaking down, something that gave it an edge over the competition. But it didn't just dominate Trans Am. In 1968, Dave Strickler took a Z/28 to the drag strip and won the IHRA Superstock World title. It proved that the 302 V8 wasn't just a road course engine. It could win anywhere. An engine that was never supposed to happen. Well, the truth is, the 302 V8 was never part of General Motors' plan. It broke the company's own engine size restrictions, disrupted Chevrolet's carefully structured lineup, and delivered performance levels that made executives uncomfortable. By the time the higher-ups realized what was happening, the engine had already made its way onto the streets and racetracks, changing the muscle car world forever. The late 1960s were a high-stakes battlefield for American car manufacturers. Ford, Chrysler, and GM were locked in an all-out war for horsepower supremacy, each pushing the limits to outperform the competition. But among all their battles, one arena stood above the rest: the Trans Am Racing Series. The rules were clear. Engines couldn't be larger than 305 cubic inches. Ford had already developed a 302 V8 to dominate the series, while Chevrolet's smallest performance engine at the time was the 327, which was too big to qualify. Chevy's engineers knew they needed a solution. Instead of designing a completely new engine, they got creative. By combining a 327 engine block with the crankshaft from a smaller 283, they created a 302 cubic inch V8 that fit within the rules, while secretly packing far more power than anyone expected. The factory's secret creation. Right when GM's top bosses were trying to keep engine sizes under control, Chevy's engineers had other ideas. They wanted a small but powerful V8 that could go toe-to-toe with Ford's Mustang in the SCCA Trans Am Racing Series. But there was a problem. GM's rules didn't allow engines smaller than 327 cubic inches in its high-performance lineup. That meant the 302 should not have existed. Yet, in a move that felt more like a secret experiment than an official project, Chevy's performance team found a way around the rules. Instead of designing an entirely new engine, they took two existing Chevy small blocks and combined their best parts. The result was a Frankenstein creation that GM never truly wanted, but car enthusiasts would never forget. Even though the 302 was small in size, it wasn't built like an economy engine. Every part was designed to handle extreme conditions. The engine came with a forged steel crankshaft, forged connecting rods, and forged aluminum pistons. This was high-end race-level material, not the kind of parts usually found in a factory-built street car. But Chevy didn't stop there. They knew that to make serious power, the 302 needed to breathe better than any other small block of time. So, they gave it high-performance cylinder heads with large 2.02-inch intake valves and 1.60-inch exhaust valves. These heads had huge intake and exhaust ports to move as much air as possible through the engine at high RPM. The famous Duntov 3030 camshaft. One of the biggest reasons the 302 was so special was its camshaft. Chevy fitted it with a mechanical lifter cam known as the Duntov 3030. This cam was named after Zora Arkus Duntov, the legendary GM engineer who helped design it. The 3030 cam had a wild lift of 0.452 inches on the intake and 0.455 inches on the exhaust, along with a long duration that allowed the engine to make power high in the RPM range. This cam was not meant for comfort, it was meant for speed. It gave the 302 a rough idle, a sound that was instantly recognizable, and the ability to rev past 7,000 RPM. A high RPM monster. Unlike most V8s of the time, which were designed for low-end torque, the 302 was built to scream at high RPM. To feed the engine at full throttle, Chevy equipped it with a Holley 780C FM 4-barrel carburetor sitting on a high-rise aluminum intake manifold. This setup allowed the engine to gulp down air at a rapid rate, making it ideal for road racing. The 302's ignition system was just as aggressive. Chevy used a special distributor with a high-performance advance curve, allowing the engine to rev freely without hesitation. At a time when most muscle car engines redlined between 5,500 and 6,000 RPM, the 302 was capable of hitting 7,500 RPM, and beyond if you had the nerve to push it. Built for a purpose. Unlike the big blocks Chevy was selling at the time, the 302, every detail of the engine was engineered with one goal in mind: winning the Trans Am Racing Championship. Chevy made sure that every 302-powered Camaro came with a heavy-duty cooling system, a deep sump oil pan, and a high-flow fuel pump. These were not just minor upgrades. They were necessary for an engine that was going to be pushed to its limits on the track. A limited production engine dash. One of the biggest reasons the 302 is so legendary today is its rarity. Chevy only built the engine for 3 model years: 1967, 1968, and 1969. In total, fewer than 30,000 cars were ever equipped with the 302. Compared to the hundreds of thousands of big block Chevys that rolled off the assembly line, the 302 was almost a ghost. It wasn't just rare, it was unique. No other Chevy small block had the same high-revving nature, the same aggressive valve train, or the same racing DNA. It was a purpose-built engine, and it was only ever intended for one car, the Z/28 Camaro. The special cross-ram intake option. Then in 1969, Chevy decided to take the 302 to an even crazier level. They introduced an optional cross-ram intake system that featured 2 Holley 585 cubic feet per minute carburetors sitting on a high-rise manifold. This setup was designed purely for racing, as it allowed even more air to rush into the engine at high speeds. The cross-ram intake looked wild under the hood, and it delivered more top-end horsepower. However, it made the engine difficult to tune for street driving, which is why most buyers stuck with the standard single-carb setup. California's Special Emissions Version Dash. For most of its production run, the 302 came with a single Holley 780 CFM carburetor. However, in 1967, Chevy had to make an exception for cars sold in California. Because of the state's strict emissions regulations, any Z28 sold there was required to have an AIR system. This meant that California buyers got a slightly different version of the 302, one with a special emissions-friendly carburetor. However, by 1968, all 302s were equipped with the AIR system, making the California versions less unique. While adjustments to California's strict emissions laws have been made, the 302 V8 continued its fight on the streets and the track. But while this little powerhouse had all the makings of a legendary engine, it wasn't just emissions that led to its downfall. The 302 was fast, reliable, and a favorite among racers, yet it disappeared after just 3 years. So why was this engine banned? And how did it really compare to the Ford 302? Stay tuned, I will reveal this in a while. Built for racing, but not for the streets. Chevy didn't build the 302 for everyday driving. It was made for one purpose: to dominate Trans Am racing. The rulebook required engines to be under 305 cubic inches, so Chevy took their 327 and swapped in a 283 crankshaft, creating a 302 cubic inch monster. However, this high-revving nature made it less practical for the average driver. Unlike other small-block V8s that delivered strong low-end torque, the 302 needed to be pushed hard to unlock its full power. For stop-and-go traffic or daily commutes, this wasn't ideal. It also required a skilled driver who knew how to handle high-revving engines, something that not every Camaro buyer had. Performance that shocked the competition. Even with its daily driving drawbacks, the Chevy 302 was nearly unbeatable on the track. In the 1968 and 1969 Trans Am seasons, the Penske Camaro with Mark Donohue behind the wheel dominated, winning the manufacturer's championship both years. But it wasn't just road racing where the 302 shined. Drag racers also found ways to squeeze even more power out of it. With simple modifications, this small block could produce over 400 horsepower. Some racers even claimed that with a few tweaks, it could take down bigger V8s with ease. The problems that couldn't be ignored. Despite its racing success, the 302 had its fair share of issues. First, there was a lack of low-end torque. While it could roar to life at high RPMs, it wasn't as quick off the line as some other V8s. This made it less desirable for street performance, where instant power was often more important than top-end speed. Then there was the cost. Chevy built the 302 with high-performance parts, including forged pistons, a high-lift solid camshaft, and a dual-plane aluminum intake. While these parts made it strong, they also made it expensive to produce. Compared to other small blocks like the 350, the 302 didn't make much financial sense for Chevrolet. And of course, emissions played a role in its downfall. As government regulations became stricter, high-compression engines like the 302 became harder to justify. The writing was on the wall. Chevy needed something more practical. Ford 302 versus Chevy 302. The rivalry continues. No doubt if Chevy's 302 had one true rival, it was Ford's 302. Both engines had the same displacement, but they were built with different goals in mind. Chevy didn't just throw together a small block engine and call it a day. The 302 cubic inch engine was designed specifically for performance. It had a high-revving nature, an aggressive camshaft, and a strong bottom end. Meanwhile, Ford's 302 engine was built for a different purpose. It was a solid, small block, but it wasn't designed to be a high-performance monster from the factory. It had a lower compression ratio of 9.0 to 1 compared to Chevy's 11.0 to 1. That alone meant less power and less excitement. While Ford's 302 did well in some areas, it just didn't have the same raw energy as the Chevy version. Some say numbers don't lie, and in the case of racing, that's absolutely true. The best way to settle an argument about engines is to see how they perform on the track. In the late 1960s, the SCCA Trans Am series was the ultimate battleground for small-block muscle cars. In 1969, Chevy-powered Camaros won 8 out of 12 races. Ford's Mustangs only managed to win 4. That's a clear victory for Chevy. Mark Donohue and the Penske racing team dominated with the Chevy 302, proving that it was the engine to beat. Even in drag racing, the 302-powered Z28 was a force. In 1968, Dave Strickler took home the IHRA Superstock World title with his 302 Chevy. The results speak for themselves. When it came to competition, the Chevy 302 was king. Walk around any classic car show and you'll notice something interesting. A lot of Ford cars have Chevy engines under the hood. That's because the Chevy small block, including the 302, is one of the most popular engine swaps of all time. Why? It fits into almost anything, parts are easy to find, and most importantly, it makes more power. Some Mustang owners have even swapped out their Ford engines for a Chevy small block, something Ford fans probably don't like to admit. The truth is, the Chevy 302 is just easier to work with. It's reliable, it's powerful, and it has an aftermarket support system that Ford's 302 just can't match. At the end of the day, both the Ford 302 and Chevy 302 have their place in automotive history. Ford guys will always argue that their small block is just as good, but the numbers tell a different story. Chevy's 302 was more powerful, more successful in racing, and more desirable among engine builders. Ford's Boss 302 put up a fight, but Chevy's version proved superior when it mattered most. The 302 wasn't just a great engine, it was a championship-winning legend. The Chevy 305, a poor replacement. When Chevy discontinued the 302 after 1969, they introduced the 305 as a small block alternative. But let's be honest, it wasn't even close. The 305 was designed with fuel economy in mind, not performance. While the 302 was built to scream past competitors, the 305 was built to sip gas and meet emission standards. It lacked the aggressive cam, the high-revving power band, and the overall attitude of the 302. In stock form, the 305 made anywhere from 130 to 180 horsepower, far below the legendary 302. Even with later fuel-injected versions pushing out around 215 horsepower, it still couldn't match the raw power of its predecessor. Chevy fans knew it too. Many saw the 305 as a disappointment, a weak follow-up to an engine that had built a reputation as one of the best small blocks ever made. The 302's untimely end. Well, the official explanation for the 302's disappearance was simple: emissions laws and changing consumer trends. But the real reason? This engine was just too powerful for its own good. Chevy's 302 V8 was shaking up the industry. It offered performance that rivaled big block engines while being lighter and more agile. If buyers could get nearly the same speed and power from a smaller high-revving engine, why would they pay more for a heavier 396 or 427? GM wasn't about to let that happen. Behind closed doors, executives saw the 302 as a problem. It didn't fit into their long-term plans, so they slowly pushed it out. First, they restricted production. Then, they pulled back on marketing. And finally, by 1970, the 302 was completely gone. Even racers pleaded with Chevy to keep the 302 alive for competition use, but their requests fell on deaf ears. The message was clear: this engine had made too much noise, and it was time to silence it. Legacy. While GM may have wanted the 302 to disappear, its impact was impossible to erase. This engine didn't just perform well, it dominated racetracks and left a lasting mark on motorsports history. Even though the 302 was gone after 1969, its legend never faded. Today, it's one of Chevy's most celebrated small block engines. Z/28 Camaros from this era are now prized collector's cars, and engine builders still admire the 302 for its high-revving performance. Even in modern times, this engine continues to roar on the streets and racetracks. Enthusiasts rebuild, modify, and push these motors to their limits, proving that the 302 was never just another engine. It was a masterpiece. But if you ask any Chevy fan which engine they'd take, the legendary 302 or the underwhelming 305, the answer is obvious. The 302 was built to dominate. The 305 was built to compromise. And that's why one became an icon while the other faded into obscurity. What do you think about Chevy's banned 302 V8? Was it a masterpiece that got unfairly restricted, or did the rules make sense? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into legendary engines.